Hello, today I'm going to be talking about my experience reading Malazan Book of the Fallen as a first-time reader. Now, I have not read any of the other books in the Malazan series. I've only read the 10-book series by Erikson, and this is going to be a very personal experience because Malazan is very multi-layered. There are so many characters, so many themes, such complex magic and world building, and a very nuanced approach to narration. So my experience won't be like anyone else's, to say the least. And before I get into my feelings on each of the 10 books, I'll say that this is going to be a spoiler-free video. I'm not going to give a plot overview or anything. I'll just be sharing my personal thoughts. I have had some requests to do a ranking video, and I won't be doing that because honestly, I find that so hard to do. My thoughts and feelings on these books have shifted as I've read on in the series. And if you want, after I go through the 10 books, you can put them in ranking order for me if you'd like, or tell me what your order would be. But that's the best I can do, is just tell you my experience with each of these 10 books. I also want to go into a couple of things that I think affected my experience as a first-time reader. So one of those things is expectation. I went into this series not knowing anything about it. I had no concept of what it was about. I didn't even know that there were 10 books in the series. And I feel like that was an advantage because when I talk to people these days about Malazan, it's like they've heard so much that it becomes this insurmountable mountain, Malazan. You could just feel the dread or the weight in the word Malazan. And I'm so glad I didn't have that association when I started the series. I didn't even know how to pronounce it correctly or anything. So I think that was an advantage for me just to go in without any expectation, without any weight on my shoulders. And it was a big advantage as I read on in the series, and a lot of Malazan content started to emerge on BookTube. So I got to take advantage of that and even engage in some discussions of my own once I started a channel right before I started book 4. So that has definitely played a role in my experience. And another thing I'll talk about is the spacing out of books, because I feel like I spaced out the first 3 books way too much. I made the decision last year to go ahead and prioritize this series above all others. That way I could finish it in 2021. And I actually finished The Crippled God a day before New Year's Eve. And that was the best decision I've ever made for my reading life. I did read the last 3 books back to back. It is recommended to do this for books 9 and 10 because book 10 is a direct continuation of book 9. There isn't even a prologue for book 10, and I think that is sound advice. I know everyone is going to approach this differently, especially considering some people like to put books between books in the series, but for me, I just found that not taking too much time between books served me in remembering details. Now for my thoughts and feelings on each of the 10 books. So starting off with Gardens of the Moon, I loved Gardens of the Moon. I know this isn't considered a highlight for many people in the series, but I loved it. I think that everything was set up really well with this first book. And I thought it was just so unique. I had never read anything quite like it. I remember feeling like the tone of the book felt very different than anything I had read before. And I found the magic so intriguing in this world. At the time, I was reading fantasy with a lot of hard magic systems. So for me, it was refreshing to have something totally different with the magic. And I liked the quirkiness of some of the characters, and I liked the settings. It was just a really wonderful read for me. I tabbed up the heck out of my Gardens of the Moon copy. And I remember as soon as I finished reading Gardens of the Moon, I had this feeling like I could go back to the beginning and start all over because I was just that fascinated by everything I had read. And then I found when I finished that I could go back to earlier pages and just have a new context for certain things I noticed at the beginning. I also noticed Erikson having a talent for shifting perspectives in this first book. So again, Gardens of the Moon was a special read for me. I enjoyed my time reading it. Now on to Dead House Gates, book number 2. This was quite the adjustment for me. I didn't expect to be on a whole new continent with a whole new cast of characters. And I feel like the pacing is quite a bit slower because it is more of a journey book than Gardens of the Moon. And that was a huge adjustment for me. I did see the theme of witnessing and of course the role of history playing a huge part in this book. And I find that you are challenged as a reader to engage in empathy for a particular character who is struggling. So I feel like you as a reader are challenged in that way. And there are some obviously very powerful things that happen in Dead House Gates if you've read it towards the end, which I won't give away. But even though I had some struggles adjusting to this book, I did find that the storylines in this book stayed with me months later. I couldn't stop thinking about this book. And of all the 10 books, this is the book I want to reread the most. Now on to Memories of Ice, book number 3, and you can even tell with the title Memories of Ice, a lot of the titles in Malazan Book of the Fallen are kind of metaphors or hint at themes, and memory is no exception. So memory definitely plays a role. You do find out about the background of certain races and their history and why they have interacted the way that they have for so much time. So of course, the role of history is there as well. And while I had heard up until that point that compassion and empathy would be major themes in the series, and I did talk about how I think you as a reader are challenged to do that a bit with Dead House Gates with a certain character, I feel like the compassion theme really comes to the forefront in Memories of Ice. I found myself moved to tears a few times in this book. I also found this book had a very challenging perspective on motherhood that I think is very important. And this book actually put me like in an altered state of consciousness. I felt like I had come out of a cave or something after I finished Memories of Ice. It was a very powerful experience for me. So going on from there, I knew, by the way, once I finished Memories of Ice, that I was committed to this series. And then going on from there into House of Chains, we follow one main POV for a while in the first part of House of Chains. We are introduced to one of my favorite characters in the series in House of Chains. I knew that this was a least favorite book for a lot of people, but I went in with an open mind because I love Gardens of the Moon. And I ended up loving House of Chains. I thought this book was incredible. So this book not only deals with history, but I think it deals with history in a personal way, questions of history and agency for one's personal path. It's also an exploration on cultural relativism. And this book doesn't have the same rise and fall of action as some of the previous books or other books in fantasy, but I think the way it was handled was just perfect. I felt like some of the moments in this book were very intimate for me. They hit me very deeply. And like Memories of Ice, I felt as though I was in an altered state of consciousness after I finished House of Chains. It cut so deep for me. I got emotional about this book for months after reading it. And then going on from there into Midnight Tides. Now, Midnight Tides is a fan favorite for a lot of people, but I think it's important to note that it's not an easy book to get into initially because we do go to another new continent and cast of characters. And so I feel it takes a while to get your grounding in Midnight Tides, but it is also a very powerful exploration of colonization, imperialism, two different societies clashing with one another, two different races. And also very powerful exploration on trauma. This particular book actually got me thinking about some things in my life in a much deeper way than almost any other book has in fiction. So I am very grateful to this book, actually. It really did cut deep, and I really enjoyed what it did with certain fantasy tropes. So Midnight Tides, a fan favorite for a reason. And then going on from there, the Bone Hunters, you just hit the ground running and it doesn't stop. I think the pacing in this book is fast. It is amazing. So I felt engaged in this story from beginning to end, and amazing battle scenes, amazing political reveals that happen at the end of this book. And this book I think of as a rite of passage book. It does explore all the previous themes mentioned, but also loyalty and leadership, faith in gods. And like I said, I really think of this as a rite of passage book. That's how I think of it. And I loved it. I thought it was so action-packed. And then next, Reaper's Gale. Reaper's Gale was a book that was a real interesting journey for me because I found that there were certain storylines and characters I was struggling to get into. And there was a storyline I really wanted to focus on. And so I had a bit of a tug of war feeling as I was reading this book. And then I was expecting something to happen, this buildup to happen for something, and it didn't quite work out that way. So right when I thought, okay, this isn't going to be a favorite for me, suddenly it was like Erikson just pulled the ground out from underneath me. And I ended up getting so emotional at things that happened towards the end of this book, so emotional. And I have to say that after reading the last book in this series, The Crippled God, that book actually got me to look back at certain things that happened in this book a little bit differently. So very powerful book. As you can imagine with the title like Reaper's Gale, this one does explore death in an interesting way, or the state between life and death. And from what I've learned, there is also a theme of futility in this book, which actually brings things into perspective as well. So this was a powerful book for me, even though I had some struggles initially. And then from there, Toll the Hounds. Toll the Hounds is literally a heavy book, but also it's thematically heavy. We explore love and grief and redemption and absolution. And we return also to a location we hadn't been in a long time and some characters we hadn't seen in a long time. It is quite the emotional book. And it is a book that I finished and felt like I wasn't finished with it. And then I had a discussion on my channel, which was wonderful, but I still didn't feel like I was finished with this book. Like there was so much to unpack. I went back and I reread sections of this book several times, and they felt fresh to me every time I'd reread them. I know this is very much a fan favorite for a lot of people, and I can understand why. For me, there were certain parts of this book that didn't quite resonate for me personally, but I can appreciate why it is so important and impactful for so many people. I do think it speaks to a certain perspective or a certain person at a certain time in life personally, but there was a lot that I did resonate with too. So it's a mixed bag. I did get into this discussion with Jimmy and Philip and Alan over on Jimmy's channel, The Fantasy Network. And I felt like that discussion really helped me process a lot of my feelings for this book, but I feel like there's always so much more to this book. It's a heavy-handed book. It's an amazing work, and it's one that I struggle to describe in any simple way. And then going on from there, from Toll the Hounds into Dust of Dreams. Dust of Dreams for me was the darkest book in the series. It's possibly the darkest book I've ever read. There is a chapter in this book that is so heavy and hard, and I highly recommend checking out trigger warnings for this book and maybe the series before starting. It's very, very heavy. So we really do explore some of the ugliest parts of human nature in this book. We learn more about a couple of other races too, and their perspectives on humans, which is very interesting. And we do learn about these different nomadic societies, indigenous societies, and it was nice that we have more than one perspective regarding these cultures. But it is heavy, it is hard, and it is important, of course, and it definitely leads right into The Crippled God, which is the final book. And the final book, The Crippled God, for me was like a brilliant synthesis of all the themes presented up until that point. So I loved The Crippled God. Of course, we explore empathy and compassion at its finest in this book. And what a ride, what a ride. It was fascinating. Now, I have to say that as much as I've loved this book, I did find there were certain things that were still a little unclear for me after finishing. And there were things I had to be kind of informed about in the book. But I'm still overall satisfied with it as a first-time reader. And I very much look forward to this experience again on reread. So that about concludes my journey through Malazan Book of the Fallen as a first-time reader. Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section below if you plan to read it, if you've read it, how these books were for you, and your thoughts on my thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.